Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so thrilled that you've been able to join us. We might still have a few more folks sign in along the way. I believe we have another 100 or so that have RSVP'd for this event. In the interest of time, however, I think I'll go ahead and kick us off. My name is Tom Jacobs. I'm the Environmental Program Director with Mid-America Regional Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the kickoff for our public engagement process to develop our Regional Climate Action Plan. So today's event is one in which we will share our recently completed Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory and Climate Risk and Vulnerability Assessment. And we hope to share that with you and answer any questions you might have. We have a list of fantastic presenters to share with you today. And they will begin with Mayor Mike Kelly and Councilwoman Lindsay Constance from the city of Shawnee, but then followed by Bob Berkebile, Ryan Glancy from the Global Covenant of Mayors International Urban Cooperation Program, and then Doug Norsby, who will speak to the emissions inventory, Karen Clausen, who will walk us through the assessment, Sabrina Bornstein from Borough Happold, our technical advisors on this process, and then I'll wrap this up at the end. We have about 90 minutes for this whole program, and we intend to take about the first 60 minutes in presentation, leaving us about 30 minutes at the end to have an ample time for discussion and to respond to questions. Please note that we've muted everybody's microphones, and so if you have any questions, please take advantage of the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that so that we can respond to all the questions in an effective way. And if we're unable to answer any questions at the end, then we will provide answers in writing that we can post online, and also direct you to the MindMixer website that we'll talk more about in a minute, where we can further discuss any issues or concerns that you might have. The spirit of this event is just to really open up the planning process to the broader community and help us all think as creatively as possible to identify the best solutions and the best plan that we can make to become a climate resilient community. So with that in mind, I'd like to hand the microphone over to Mayor Kelly and Councilwoman Constance.
All right, good morning and welcome to phase 2 of the Climate Action Plan as we launch into our community engagement process. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to provide your unique perspective and insight as we work together to create a more resilient future in Kansas City. We're Mike and Lindsay, Chairman and President of Climate Action KC. I represent the City of Shawnee on the City Council, and Mike is the Mayor of Roland Park. Thank you to the Mid-America Regional Council and the International Urban Cooperation Initiative of the European Union and the Global Covenant of Mayors.
And thank you to all of Kansas City that has come and spent a little time with us for this webinar. Climate Action KC is a Big Ten organization. We're 115 plus local elected officials representing 10 different layers of local government, but we're also community leaders in business, in nonprofit organizations, at the city staff, but also part of our robust educational team here in Kansas City through our dynamic universities and high schools. We've really come together since December of 2018 because we have a shared concern about climate change and about how that's going to affect Kansas City. Things like extreme heat or flooding or drought that we've seen increase in the last few years. We recognize that we have a collective desire to do more, though, to not only reduce our emissions levels, but in doing so, focus on those good things and fast track those good things that reducing our emissions can do. Things like providing us economic benefits or improving our public health, but also our quality of life. We are from Kansas City and very proud of it. Kansas City is such a unique place. Yes, we're 2 states, 10 counties, 2 million people strong, but there is something special here being from the Midwest, the crossroads of a nation. We have unique challenges here. But we also have unique work ethic and innovation. And we know that based on those traits, we can innovatively respond to a changing climate.
Well, we're here today to introduce the baseline, where we are as a region, both in terms of greenhouse emissions, but also to identify where we are vulnerable to the effects of a changing climate. Together, we will create a roadmap to the vision of Kansas City that we want for ourselves and for future generations, a future that is sustainable, economically prosperous, and resilient. This vision starts with you here today. Everyone gathered will have an opportunity to prioritize your passions through our dynamic engagement forum. We wanted to all be together in Bartle Hall, engaging in a charrette gathering to choose which actions our region will identify as the most important to a resilient future. Obviously, due to unforeseen challenges, that's not possible, but we truly believe we have the next best thing.
And if there's anything we can leave you with today, obviously, I'm very excited to share the greenhouse emissions inventory as well as the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. But if there's one thing we can leave you with today, it's a request to share your vision for a resilient Kansas City. And that's what this mind mixer process is about. It's about having Kansas City residents from all walks of life describe their own personal vision for a climate resilient Kansas City. Each of the next 5 weeks will focus on specific sectors of our community, starting with transportation, but also then including topics like food and land, built environments, our energy and in industry, but then also an opportunity for you to prioritize what action should be taken first and most prominently to lead to that vision of Kansas City that you have that is not only prosperous, but climate resilient. So please come participate in that process and then come back each week as we discuss new topics because this is a plan from Kansas City for Kansas City, and we need you to be a part of that process. We understand that this process may be new, but it's really built on a foundation of work towards a climate resilient and prosperous community that is decades in the making. Everything we do with Climate Action KC is built on the foundation that was laid for us. And I can't really think of anybody better that represents that foundation than my friend, Bob Berkebile. And we're really excited to have him here today. So thank you all very much for your time. And I look forward to hearing from Bob.
Bob, the floor is yours. Mike, Lindsay, thank you. And I'd be remiss if I didn't publicly acknowledge your extraordinary leadership with Climate Action KC and all that we've accomplished and all that we have yet to do. So thank you for everything you've done, and we appreciate your terrific leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Bob?
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Mike, Lindsay, and Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. And I want to say thanks also to Mike and Lindsay for launching this critical community conversation last year, and to all of you for adding your voices and contributions on committees, to the growing dialogue on Mind Mixer, and by participating remotely today. I, like Lindsay, would rather be in Bartle Hall as planned to see you without the technology. But this is more appropriate, and ironically, I think it may be more powerful. That is, considering our future together while we are separate. At our first summit, I shared that this community dialogue is the most important we have ever had or will ever have. And since the virus arrived and disrupted our lives, I am more convinced of that now than I was then. How many times have you or someone you heard referred to creating the new normal? Just last week, Nick Tilson, who's a wise young Lakota leader at Pine Ridge, said that their community doesn't want a new normal because they've discovered that normal just doesn't work for them. And I think if we take a critical look, we'll find that normal wasn't working for any of us. I and my colleagues at BNIM have had the privilege of working with 12 communities now in a post-natural disaster environment. And I'd like to share 3 observations from that work that I think applies to our deliberations today. The first of which is a major disruption always reveals what was broken socially, economically, and environmentally before that event. Second, there's a window of opportunity to take a critical look as a community at what was in place when the disruption occurred and decide that we want to create something much better. But unfortunately, that window of opportunity closes very rapidly because we are somehow hardwired to rebuild exactly what we had when the event occurred, and then at the very earliest moment, and then argue over who's going to pay for it. But 3, if we can come together as a community in a dialogue of discovery, we can in fact change our future, and we have seen that over and over. We, in this case, or the dialogue, as Mike said earlier, means all residents, all of the people, colors, beliefs, incomes in this community, just as the definition of pandemic means all people. Margaret Wheatley wrote, "There is no force stronger than a community that has decided what it truly cares about." As disruptive and destructive as this invisible virus has been, it has also given the planet a chance to breathe. The air and water haven't been this clean for more than a century, destroying the myth that climate change was not caused or is not related to human activity. Greta Thunberg told us that we just weren't listening. And she was right, we weren't. But this virus has reduced our background noise and given us a unique time to listen and observe our fragility, our inequity, obsolete human systems, and to reflect on the resilience and beauty of nature, and rediscover that we are an integral part of nature, interdependent, and the co-creators of our future. Also, Arundhati Roy, the author of The God of Small Things and much more, wrote in the Financial Times, I think it was last week, that the pandemic is a portal or a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, she says, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Without any doubt, COVID-19 has changed our lives forever. But how our lives, our community, and our planet will look in the future is entirely up to us. And for that reason, I am very optimistic. This is the right moment. The heartland of America is the right place. And you are exactly the right people to change the course of human history. Thank you for investing your hearts, heads, and hands so creatively in our children's future. Thank you for being here, and thanks for what you are about to accomplish.
Bob, thank you so much. As Mike said, all of our work here is building on decades of previous work in Kansas City, working towards sustainability and resilience, and you've been the leader for much of that work. We've all been standing on your shoulders, and your challenge to us and your optimism is something I think that will really undergird all of our work moving forward. So thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ryan Glancy. Ryan has been our guide in working through our partners with the European Union through the Global Covenant of Mayors and the International Urban Cooperation Program. He's been facilitating work with us in Kansas City and other metros around the United States. He'll share more about how we fit into a larger context in developing our work and how how we can help our peers and meet the global challenge in front of us. So Ryan, you're up.
Thanks a lot, Tom. And good afternoon, everyone. At the risk of being a little bit repetitive, just wanted to say thank you so much to Mayor Kelly and Councilwoman Constance and Tom for your leadership in this initiative. It's been really promising, the work that we've done so far. Now that we're engaging with the broader stakeholder group here today, I see great things. And thanks also to Bob for your inspirational remarks and call to action on the group. I think you know, we've got a lot of good momentum here and hoping that can continue. So, and just before I get started, I just want to say that I've been working on developing climate action plans with cities for over 10 years now, and this group is by far the largest stakeholder workshop or webinar that I've ever been involved in. So huge congratulations first off to the Mid-America Regional Council and team, and thanks to all on the line for joining us here today. I think you'll see, you know, a lot of technical information and data presented on the slides today, but a lot of this work really is about kind of winning the hearts and minds of people to act on climate change. So with the great participation that we have from all of you here today, I think we're off to a great start on that front. So I just, as Tom mentioned, I just wanted today to take a few minutes to just briefly set a bit of the framework and context that this project is working within. As Tom mentioned, I work for a program called International Urban Cooperation. It's a European Union funded initiative focused, as the name suggests, on working with cities, working with them together on key issues, mostly around sustainability and climate change. And one of the key components of the program is helping to establish what's called the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy Initiative, or GCOM. And GCOM is, there's some information on the slide here, an international alliance of more than 10,000 cities, regions, and communities who have committed to working collectively to tackle climate change. I'm sure a lot of the people on the line today will know the stats, but cities account for over 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And so action by cities to reduce emissions is really where the battle on climate change will be won and lost. So what GCOM aims to do effectively is to bring all these cities together, to support them, to help them share ideas. And the European Union is a core funder of the initiative at the global level, along with Bloomberg Philanthropies and some other city network partners. And now the Kansas region is formally a member of the GCOM, so it's really great to have you aboard. Okay, next slide, please, Alicia. So across the last kind of 3.5 years while the IUC program has been running, we've been working with cities and city networks in the US. And it gradually became clear that there was an opportunity or even a demand to try to foster some more regional and metropolitan scale collaboration in climate change planning. It's really an approach that's been very prevalent and successful across the pond in the European Union. And as an EU program, you know, we wanted to try and replicate that success and approach here in the US. So just about a year ago, a little bit more, we launched an open call for regions and metropolitan areas to apply for some technical support, an initiative we call the Metro Scale Climate Leaders Initiative. And I'm really pleased to say that the Kansas metropolitan region was successful in that application. And we've now been working together for about 10 months, I think. So as part of that assistance, we've hired a consultant firm mentioned earlier, Borough Happold, led here today by Sabrina Bornstein and her team. And their job is to support the Mid-America Regional Council staff in the work we're going to discuss today, namely developing a greenhouse gas inventory for the region, undertaking a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, setting a target to reduce GHG emissions into the future, and then looking at the suite of mitigation and adaptation actions and helping to prioritize those to help us achieve those targets and build resiliency across the region. And then finally, to help compile and draft a climate action plan document that will serve as the plan moving forward. In addition to the technical support provided by Borough Happold team, we're also trying to facilitate some knowledge exchange between US and EU regions. That's through a series of in-person meetings and webinars that we're organizing. And then lastly, as this is a pilot project, we'll be looking to promote the work that you all are doing, both nationally and internationally, as a kind of a best practice example. And obviously the hope there will be that other regions will look to follow in your footsteps. Next slide, please. So I'm really pleased to say that the Kansas region is, leading the charge in terms of regional climate collaboration in the US, along with the other 3 regions that were successful on the application to the program, which are metropolitan regions around Washington, DC, Chicago, and the Denver-Boulder area. And so I think you'll see, from the rest of the slides in the webinar today that the MARC team have done an awful lot of great work on this already. And now is the time for us to kind of turn that over to all of you, so you can let us know what you think about the work done so far, but more importantly, to help us develop a plan that you can all get on board with moving forward. So yeah, echo the sentiments of Mayor Kelly, and would love for you to, once this session is finished, to go over to MindMixer and download your thinking there, so that we can follow up with all your good ideas. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for the time today, and look forward to the rest of the webinar.
Ryan, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure working with you and hearing your voice and understanding how we fit in a truly global movement of 10,000 cities that are participating in GCOM. So from now, we're going to transition to the next segment of our program. We're going to, Doug Norsby will walk you through our greenhouse gas inventory work we've done, and Karen Clausen will discuss the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. So, and then from there, we'll wrap up with the discussion on the planning process like Ryan just outlined. Doug, you're up.
Thank you, Tom. So the first part of this project that we got into was the emissions inventory. It's hard to know where you need to go until you figure out where you're at. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Alicia. The purpose of the inventory is to really assess the region's carbon footprint and look at all the different sectors that are contributing to it, and just how much of the emissions are kind of associated with different activities. So creating that greenhouse gas inventory is really just the first step in identifying mitigation targets and actions. So it requires, looking over everything and figuring out what the emissions factors are, what kind of emissions are being generated by those different types of activities, and looking at what you have as kind of an overall budget of emissions that you'll need to kind of scale back. And next slide. So there are quite a number of different sectors that we'll eventually and ultimately look at. But to begin with, we started with 3 main sectors where most of the emissions are being generated from. One is stationary energy, which includes building and facility energy consumption that's related through natural gas, steam generation, grid electricity. Transportation, primarily on-road travel, such as private automobiles, commercial trucks, and buses. Waste, which is both, we look at what is being generated within our regional boundary and what we are generating, and then goes kind of outside the boundary and figuring out what that balance is. And then looking at the wastewater that's generated within the regional boundary, because there's an awful lot of energy used in trying to clean up our water before we can either use it or release it back to the environment. Next slide. Getting data is not necessarily a simple practice. There has been an awful lot of effort put into trying to track progress, and we're looking back to 2005 as our baseline year, but there's been a lot of change in this past decade and 10 to 15 years, where we've had groups that have been merging, we've had introduction of new technologies and techniques, and trying to sort those things out and get the data for the inventory has been an effort. To do that, we've relied on our partners and some of the data collection that our GIS services at MARC have been able to provide. So I couldn't express in sufficient ways how important our relationship has been with our energy producers: Spire Energy, One Gas, Kansas Gas Service, Atmos, Veolia. Spire has been really good. KCP&L, and now they're now Evergy. Independence Power and Light, Westar, which is one of the subsidiaries of Evergy. All of these different groups have not just provided raw data, but they've been able to give us some insight into the emissions factors that are associated with generating the energy that they've produced. This lets us figure out, in terms of forecasting and backcasting, what future energy consumption is going to result in emissions. So, on the transportation side, we've used the MOVES model from EPA to project out the contributions of carbon dioxide equivalent gas all the way out to 2050. There's some good news there in terms of the technologies that have been introduced and improvements in engines that have shown up in this last 15 years. And then waste. There's awful lot of waste numbers that are regularly collected and sent to the states. And so we've been able to get our data from some of those agencies. Next slide. So here is kind of the results. We were able to get some really solid information for 2015 and estimated stationary energy that's being used in the different buildings, building types. Get a good number, a good handle on the transportation side of things, what's being developed in the on-road transportation, and on solid waste. And you can see that roughly it breaks up into a third, a third, a third. There's an awful lot of shared contributions in this. So that means that there are quite a number of different areas that we can look to, both for reviewing the emissions that we've got and for looking at opportunities for reduction. Next slide. Oh, gotta go the other way. There we go. So one of the big things that we found on energy, on the energy emissions numbers, has been that. Go ahead and go back one more if you would, Alicia. There's been an awful lot of increase in consumption between 2005 and 2015. As far as natural gas and steam, it increased 8%, so approaching 10%. But electricity consumption has really raised, and it's gone up 51%. So the production of that level of energy has an emissions cost that's been associated with that. However, the emissions intensity of the electricity grid in both Kansas and Missouri has been reduced by roughly 17%. There's been an awful lot of investment by the utilities in trying to bring down the emissions that are associated with the generation of that power. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of those contributions include Evergy's commitment to clean energy, and that is to cut their 2000 emissions levels 80% by 2050. So they're lining right up with where we want to go as a region. And in the last 15 years or so, 10 to 15 years, they've already reduced CO2 by 40%, SO2 by 98%, and NOx by 87%. Those are all major greenhouse gases. Investment in renewable fuel sources increased 50 times. So they went from 0.4% to 25%. In that time, they've retired 2,200 megawatts of fossil fuel and brought 3,300 megawatts of wind generation capacity online. And this is an expanding program. They're already kind of at the forefront of wind. It's gone beyond just looking at the emissions and the fuel types that are being used in energy production, and it's also looking at energy efficiency and conservation. So Evergy has had annual savings of $1 million, or 1 million megawatt hours due through their energy efficiency programs between 2005 and 2018. They offer a number of different creative ways to support these things. These support the move toward renewable energy by offering subscriptions that kind of define you as receiving your energy from these renewables, and kind of supporting the investment and development of those resources. They've also got some credits that are available for people who are taking and installing solar installations on their own property. And they've established a network of 1,100 electric vehicle charging stations that provide support for over 10,000 vehicles within the Kansas region. Spire has also been very active. They've got rebates available for high efficiency appliance purchases that they've been offering. They have a weatherization assistance program for low-income families to try to reduce the cost burden for low-income folks, as well as reduce the amount of energy that people need to use. They also are very collaborative. They worked with energy efficiency programs, and they've interacted with Evergy to try to figure out the best way to provide energy services to homeowners and do it in as effective way as possible. They've been doing a heck of a job replacing aging pipeline. From 2003 to 2018, they've replaced 2,500 miles of aging pipeline across the state of Missouri, just the state of Missouri alone, at a cost of $1 billion. So they've put in a lot of time and money. So we've kind of got an idea of where we're at as our greenhouse gas situation is right now. The next step is to try to project out where we will end up. So we want to develop a business as usual projection that uses our locally specific parameters like population growth and projections to figure out what those future emissions are going to be in the region. This BAU, this business as usual projection, allows us to see what will happen to those greenhouse gas emissions if we don't do anything additional to increase our efforts beyond where we're at right now. So the 2015 greenhouse gas emissions inventory is scaled out to 2050 based on a combination of projected population growth and the transportation emissions that are expected in the region based on different projects that we'll be implementing. Over that time, here's the rough news. The greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to increase by another 28% from 2005 base year, all the way up to 37 million megatons by 2050. So again, those are based largely on population and transportation emission forecasts, and population is kind of the core driver. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Here we go. So to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement, we have to set different mitigation targets with 2005 as the base year. So 2050 is set, and we've looked at establishing 27% reduction by 2025 and a 40% reduction by 2030 as a way of looking at that trajectory of getting to where we need to be on that timeline. So here's a graph that kind of shows the business as usual is the green line, and where we actually need to try to push ourselves along the blue line. So we've got to make that inflection point. We've got to start bringing things down. We'll need to reduce those emissions to 5.7 million by 2050 to achieve that 80% reduction. That's a heavy lift. So again, our major emission sources are generally from energy in commercial buildings, residential buildings, and electricity use in general. So we've got to try to figure out ways to be more efficient in that. Then transportation through passenger vehicles and through disposal of organic wastes. And then finally, the trends, the findings on trends. The emissions have increased 4% in the region, so we're still increasing, but the population has increased by 10%. So we've been able to push our per capita emissions down by 6%. Solid waste disposal has been reduced from 2.4 million tons to 1.9 million metric tons. So that's one of the bright spots that we've been able to have too. Next slide. There we go. So now that we kind of have an idea of where we're at, I'll let Tom introduce our next speaker, figure out how we get to where we need to go.
Very good. Doug, thank you. For those of you who might not be familiar with a greenhouse gas inventory process, it's an incredibly strenuous exercise. And Doug, together with our colleague Brian Alferman, really worked diligently. They worked really hard for a really long time to pull these figures together. So Doug, Brian, I appreciate all of your work so very much. Next, we want to move on to Karen Clausen. Karen it has been putting together a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and she gets to walk us through that now. Karen?
All right, thank you. Great. Well, yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the amount of work that goes into the greenhouse gas inventory and really applaud Doug and Brian on their work to collect all of that data. That certainly was no small undertaking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate risk and vulnerability assessment, and we call it CRVA for short, so I'll probably use that moving forward. But the purpose of the CRVA is it's really to help us understand where our community is at risk in terms of climate-related hazards, and what our vulnerabilities are, as well as we try to figure out through this assessment what our capacity to adapt to some of the risks we might be facing, and how can we bounce forward. So the greenhouse gas inventory really drives kind of the mitigation decisions, and the CRVA is really focused on the adaptation side of the plan. So I included this definition of adaptation for you, which comes from IPCC, which is that any adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. So that's the definition that we use for adaptation. And again, it's part of becoming a resilient region. And I will walk through several of the different key components of the CRVA, but let's talk briefly about kind of the community that we're working with. And this same planning area is what is covered by the greenhouse gas inventory as well. So we talk about the MARC region. Douglas County has also joined this climate action planning process. So we are now working with a 10-county area, and it's a large community, if you want to use that word. We have just over 2.1 million people in this 10-county region and over 900,000 total housing units. So there's a lot of people here, and we cover a large land area. So we're over 4,800 square miles. And from a socioeconomic standpoint, there's a lot of variation across the region. So while it might say 11% living in poverty, that particular statistic, that really does vary across the region, because we have areas of really high concentration of poverty, especially in the urban core. And so that in and of itself makes the climate risk and vulnerability assessment really essential, so that we can be very targeted in our approach based on our understanding of some of these aspects of our community. So from a development pattern standpoint in our region, we're pretty spread out. Most of you know the Kansas City region pretty well. We don't have a lot of geographic features that really constrain our growth in the region. And transportation, follows a lot of our development patterns. We have plenty of roadways in our region. In fact, we have more than enough freeway miles. We have more freeway lane miles per capita than any other metro in the country, in fact. And while our access to other mobility options besides a personal vehicle is growing slowly, transit service remains rather anemic and spotty throughout the region. And access, because of that, can become kind of an issue, especially when we're talking about adaptation. Next slide, please. So we wanted to provide a little bit of context and as far as changes in climate and assessing the overall climate risk as part of the CRVA, but I'm going to kind of give you the global perspective as well. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of the trends based on what you've heard in the news or social media. But here's some really compelling graphics, and I took these from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a website called climate.gov that has a lot of great information on it. I highly recommend going there. So this chart here, it shows the history of global surface temperatures since 1880. And since pre-industrial era, there's been about a 2-degree increase in global average surface temperature. And while that increase might seem small, it takes a massive amount of heat energy to warm our global oceans to really get to this point. This extra heat is driving regional and seasonal temperature extremes around the world, reducing snow cover and sea ice, intensifying heavy rainfall, and changing habitat ranges for plants and animals, expanding some and shrinking others. And you can see on this chart that, so 2016 is that tallest red bar. That was the warmest year we have on record. 2019 was the second warmest year on record. And if you go to the next chart, which I find kind of interesting, it will show it highlights the 5 warmest years as well as the 5 coolest years. And the 5 warmest years are the 5 most recent years. And then on the green line there shows 2020. So it's right on par with being one of the warmest years. However, we're very curious about how the rest of the year will play out, given that we're going through a pandemic and we're seeing a lot of changes in human behavior as we're social distancing and staying home from work. If you go to the next chart, the next chart really explains kind of where global temperatures are projected to go. So this chart shows the results from a wide range of climate model simulations. This isn't just a simulation that's produced by one group. This is a culmination of a bunch of different models. And this one suggests that our planet's average temperature could be between 2 and 9.7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in 2100 than it is today. And it's virtually certain that our world will continue to warm over this century and beyond. And emphasizing the last bullet point here, the exact amount of warming that will occur in the coming century depends largely on the energy choices that we make now and in the next few decades. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we might expect locally as a climate outlook. So in looking at local climate impacts, we're referencing a climate look report conducted for Kansas City Water Services a few years ago called Understanding Long-Term Climate Changes for Kansas City. This data that is being reported in this study can be extrapolated for the entire region. So looking at precipitation specifically, the region is expected to experience an increase in annual average precipitation of roughly 1.5 inches by mid-century and over 2 inches by the end of the century. And here's some other facts and figures, but some of the main takeaways from kind of what I've learned about precipitation is that we're going to see a lot more extreme rainfall amounts in one rain event, but we'll also start to see excessive rainfall days due to storm stacking. So storms just coming one after another and then dumping extreme rainfall amounts will make us really susceptible to flooding and all of the additional risks that come along with that. Next slide, please. So next we'll discuss a little bit about temperature. So temperature is expected to increase, of course, as we know, by 4 degrees by mid-century and about 7 degrees by the end of the century under the kind of mid-emissions scenario that is looked at in this climate report. Heat waves are expected to continue on average by about 5 degrees by mid-century and 11 degrees by the end of the century. The number of hot days, and I feel myself just sweating thinking about this, the number of hot days above 105 degrees is projected to increase in frequency from less than 1 per year to 5 times per year by mid-century, and up to 21 times per year, or 21 times a year by the end of the century. The number of cooling degree days, which is a reflection of the demand for energy needs to cool a building or heat a building, will nearly double. Conversely, energy demand for heating will start to decline because we're going to see much more mild winters. So next slide, please. So after we really get to understand the climate projections related to our region, the next step is to assess which hazards, ones that will likely intensify due to climate change for our region, will pose the greatest risk to us. So luckily, we didn't have to do a lot of digging to find the information. As we were launching at the same time, we were working on the CRVA. MARC Emergency Services was also working on updating the hazard mitigation plan for the Missouri side of the region. We were able to use this information quite a bit to help determine which hazards we needed to be focusing on for our plan. And these particular documents that I'm referencing are profiles that were developed by MARC staff for flooding and heat and drought and tornadoes and severe thunderstorms and severe weather, winter weather. And I highly recommend, if you are from a local government and you're interested in digging into those, it has a wealth of information about past impacts and what specific cities might find. So our job then is to assess kind of the risk for each of these different hazards. And we use a risk matrix to help do this. So risk is basically probability and consequence. So what is the probability that a hazard will happen? And then how severe are the consequences? What's the impact of that particular hazard if it does occur? And you can see kind of the scales that we were using to determine where a hazard might fall on this chart. And this is a fairly common risk matrix to use. And if you go to the next slide, the next slide shows you kind of our findings based on these reports. So at the highest end of the risk matrix, you'll see we have flooding, we have drought, and we have extreme heat. These are all ones that have high probability and high consequence. However, if you look at the kind of the timeline when we can really expect the largest impacts of these hazards, flooding kind of comes out on top, because as you know, we're already starting to experience more flooding events in our region, but heat is still up there as well. Severe thunderstorms and tornadoes are in the high category, or in the moderate category, with tornadoes having a lower probability but significant impact because there's so much damage. And then winter weather is less it's a big concern here. We get a lot of ice. It can do a lot of damage to us, but it's moderate as well. So walking very quickly through each of the hazards, we looked at kind of compiling an understanding of what the impacts of each are and understanding who the most vulnerable groups are. So I won't go through these in a lot of detail, but flooding can have a significant impact on people who are in flood-prone areas, people who are difficult to reach through communications and have lack of access. It impacts people who are elderly. It impacts young children, and it has quite a bit of burden on homeowners. Some of the impacts that we see is, there can be residential displacement, a significant loss of life, public health hazards, particularly when it comes to individuals' homes where you could have high amounts of molds and other contaminants flowing into your house through water, limited access to roadways because they're flooded, and increased road maintenance. If you go to the next slide, we can talk about heat. Great. So again, heat has a high risk level to us, and it has significant impacts as well. So heat-related illnesses and mortality is a big concern, but heat also impacts insect-borne illnesses. And we can see an increase in kind of mosquito-borne illnesses due to that as well. It has an impact on air quality. So on really hot days, we have more ozone production in our region, and that is a significant public health concern. And urban areas will see a higher near surface air temperatures due to urban heat island effect as well. So we need to pay particularly close attention to areas that experience more urban heat. Vulnerable groups are ones that people who have existing medical conditions or disabilities, people who work or conduct leisure activities outside. So we're thinking about, construction workers and other outdoor workers in agriculture, etc. Elderly people are more prone to impacts of heat, and also people with lack of air conditioning and other cooling mechanisms. Are they close to cooling centers, for instance? That's an important factor. When we're talking about drought, some of the same impacts that you might see with heat, but we might see more impacts to our agriculture communities. So small or rural communities might have a harder time adapting to the impacts of drought. It impacts crop quality, and we might have lower yields, impacting kind of access to local foods here, increased irrigation costs, production losses for hydropower, which is particularly important in Douglas County, increased fire risk, loss of biodiversity. So just a whole host of issues that come with drought. Next one, please. Severe thunderstorms. The primary impacts here are flooding and blackouts. We have this happen time to time. Our severe thunderstorms are getting more severe. Blackouts, luckily, while most of our utilities are above ground in our region, specifically in urban areas, we do sometimes have power outages. They don't last long though, which is a good thing in our region. Severe thunderstorms can affect everybody, but people who have, medical conditions or disabilities, people who live in flood-prone areas, elderly, young people, people with lack of access to transportation, and homeowners. Next. Okay, tornadoes. So significant damage to buildings and infrastructure, loss of life, and lots of injuries are some of the more significant impacts of tornadoes. Blackouts as well. With tornado damage, we often see impaired transportation systems. It's often difficult as well for emergency responders to access certain areas, not only for response to tornadoes, but other responses that they might have as well. Vulnerable groups here, people who live in kind of low-income households with substandard housing, they're particularly at risk. People who are elderly and young as well. With severe winter weather, you see injuries and loss of life with winter weather that particularly affects older adults. Traffic crashes are more prevalent, property damage, power outages, telecommunication disruptions, and ice is probably the biggest culprit in a lot of these impacts, but it's severe enough that we rated this one as moderate. And it can impact a lot of different groups. Here are some that are represented. Next slide, please. Okay, so social vulnerability. Social vulnerability is another thing that we wanted to include. It's not always sort of mandated as part of a CRVA, but we felt it was particularly important in our region. And A social vulnerability index provides specific kind of social and spatially relevant information to officials and to planners to help better prepare our communities to respond to emergency events or extreme conditions generally. The exercise in our region is especially important since, as I mentioned, we have concentrated areas of poverty, we have low educational attainment, et cetera, and as such, our adaptation response should look different for different areas of the region. In other words, this information will help us be more targeted in the actions that we include in our climate action plan. So if you go back one to the social vulnerability index, we include a variety of different vulnerability indicators here. This is kind of what we call the general vulnerability index, and it includes people who have less than a high school graduation, non-white population, population below 200% of poverty, population over 65, and those who are living alone, single parent families, people who are uninsured, health insurance, and under unemployed people. As you look at the map, dark blue represents the highest socioeconomic stress, and it largely corresponds. I think most planners are nodding their heads saying, yeah, we've seen this map a million times. And our most socially vulnerable areas are pretty much aligned with kind of the older areas of our region, the urban core, specifically in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, though you will see, of course, pockets around the whole region of socioeconomic stress. You can go to the next slide, please. So we also looked at heat vulnerability index, which has a slightly different set of indicators here. And when you look at the map, the stress is a little more dispersed, and we see a lot of the same urban areas experiencing heat vulnerability. And on top of that, I'm still not seeing the slide, but hopefully I can talk to it. That particular, the heat vulnerability looks at disabled populations, it looks at zero vehicle households, populations below 200% of poverty, people over 65 and 65 living alone. And then we also looked at structures that were built before 1960, kind of as a proxy for homes that might be less energy efficient. Next slide, please. So one of the additional things we wanted to look at related to heat vulnerability is not just the socioeconomic background, but also look at go back to the previous slide, please. Looking at heat vulnerability indicators that are more specific to the urban heat island effect. So we wanted to look at tree canopy coverage in the region, but also where impervious surface is. So that's your parking lot where water just rolls off of it. So this map kind of zoomed in because these are the only areas that were identified as ones that are more vulnerable due to urban heat island. The outlines represent impervious surfacing. So looking at each track, any track that has over 35% impervious surfacing is highlighted here. And then we highlighted in kind of a teal color the tracks that both have 35% or more impervious surfacing, but have a significant enough amount of tree canopy that it's mitigated, and that it's actually maybe making an impact on the heat there. So this is a significant tool, I think, for planners to use and being able to focus down on where we can target our adaptation efforts. Future looks at this should kind of break up the track a little bit. Tracks can be rather large, and impervious surfacing can vary across it. So it'll be really important to continue this research and make it as usable as possible for local governments. So we will continue to work on this. One additional aspect to heat vulnerability, which is on the next slide, focuses on the availability of cooling centers throughout the region. We're still refining this, this particular indicator, but having access to a cooling center. So if you don't have great air conditioning at home, you're able to at least walk a short walk to a cooling center. We want to hone in more on that information. And so this is kind of the next wave of research that we will be doing. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide will focus on a flood vulnerability index. So we look at the same socioeconomic indicators from the general index that I showed on the first slide, but we're overlaying the 100-year and 500-year floodplain. It's really difficult to kind of tease out here at a regional level areas that we need to focus on. And so a recommendation moving forward is to kind of hone in more specifically on kind of block level information to understand which houses might be impacted either in the 100 or 500-year floodplain. And it's more likely that we'll be seeing 500-year floodplain floods. Next, please. One additional thing I wanted to mention on flood vulnerability is the fact that riverine flooding isn't the only type of flooding that we have in our region. Some of our infrastructure, of course, we have some combined sewers in some of our region, and sometimes that creates a different kind of flooding that many neighborhoods in our region are prone to. And so that's something else that we may need to dig into moving forward. So looking at tornado vulnerability really quickly, this adds in some additional indicators that focus on housing and housing density. So we included housing with 10+ units as well as mobile homes. And you can see the vulnerability starts to kind of spread out a little bit more because of that. We have, pockets of dense kind of residential housing all over the region. And so those are areas that are recommended for local governments to really look into and assess who's living in those areas and how they can respond better in the case of tornadoes. Next slide, please. Okay, so very quickly, because I know we're past an hour, this exercise looking at adaptive capacity really helped us focus on what are some of the areas where we need to focus more attention. What are hindrances in the region to us being able to adapt and bounce forward? Next slide, please. So for this particular exercise, which is kind of a high-level exercise and somewhat subjective, we looked at a variety of indicators that we think impact our region's adaptive capacity most, noting that there are likely more indicators out there that we could assess. And I will also note that these indicators they're fairly broad, but they're appropriate at a regional scale. And for more localized assessments, I would recommend breaking some of them apart into additional indicators. For instance, infrastructure condition can be broken apart into a variety of different types of infrastructure. So our task here was to determine which of these indicators challenged our adaptive capacity most versus least. And so we used a scale that you see on your screen here, the degree of challenge rating, going from high, moderate, low, supportive, or don't know. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the results of our assessment. We used feedback from participants in our CRVA workshop that was held last October, but we also referenced research from recent studies and other resources to help us determine our rating. So some of it's based on some facts and figures, but some of it's quite subjective as well. And so this is where we end up. Again, the red indicates areas that we might challenge we might find more challenges to adaptive capacity. And you'll see that built environment has kind of has a lot of the biggest challenges. When it comes to infrastructure capacity and infrastructure conditions specifically, we have a lot of aging infrastructure in the Kansas City region, whether it's transportation infrastructure, utility infrastructure, water and sanitation. A lot of that aging will impact the continued damage we might see from the different hazards that we can anticipate for our region. We also see that, you know, poverty and access to education, even though they're in different categories, they're oftentimes very related, and we see those as a high degree of challenge as well. Poverty in several areas of our region is quite high, with poverty being focused in, you know, Douglas County and Wyandotte County and Jackson County. Access to education is important for it's related to poverty, it's related to personal economic situations and your ability to adapt. So we highlighted that as high as well. Budgetary capacity is another one that we marked high. Government funding is always tight. Sometimes it's a little bit better if the economy is doing well, but by and large, there's always competition for funds, and everything is, you know, subject to year-to-year budget negotiations. So as we think through the type of improvements that we need to make to build a more adaptive, resilient region, we need to think through, you know, possible new funding sources to help fund some projects that get us where we need to be. Some other highlights here, areas that we're doing well, and you can go to the next slide. The next slide highlights some of the strengths that we have as a region. So we have a lot of work to do, but by and large, Kansas City is a really caring and giving community, whether we're talking about neighbors helping neighbors or our philanthropic community. We have that as a great strength here. We're also pretty good at regional coordination and leadership, and we've built a lot of relationships and connections across jurisdictional boundaries that have helped us be successful as a region. We also have a great, strong local professional and technical services industry here in Kansas City. It's one of the top industries, and that includes, you know, our engineering and architecture companies, and they can help with technical and innovative solutions that we might need for mitigation and adaptation efforts. We have a strong innovation ecosystem, as I just referenced. We have a strong social services network. We have a very low cost of living here, and have historically for a long time. And our environmental quality is fairly good as well. There's always room for improvement, but it's pretty good compared to some other metropolitan areas in the region. So with that, that wraps up the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. We do plan to include the adaptive capacity in MindMixer. Because it's such a subjective exercise, we thought it would be really interesting to put the rating of each of those indicators to all of you and see what you think. So anticipate that question coming to MindMixer very soon.
Very good. Karen, thank you. As I'm sure you all noticed, there's just a gigantic amount of work that went into that presentation, and Karen led all of that work and did a fantastic job. So I want to thank you for everything you've done. As Ryan mentioned earlier, Sabrina Bornstein heads up a team at Borough Happold, which is providing technical assistance to us, and she wanted to share a few insights about some key findings and maybe key opportunities that emerged from the greenhouse gas inventory and from the climate risk and vulnerability assessment. So Sabrina, it's been a pleasure working with you. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Tom. So we can go to the next slide. Great. So now that the region has assessed emissions and climate risk and vulnerability, the next step will be to start to develop goals and targets and identify the strategies to get there. As Tom just mentioned, and as you just saw, there was a lot of work done to pull these foundational pieces together. And there are a number of helpful takeaways that we can look at from the inventory and climate assessment that can inform the opportunities for climate action and resilience in the region. So to begin with, let's look at curbing climate change and mitigation. So As Doug reviewed, the two major sources of emissions are buildings and transportation, and this is in line with what we see for most cities and regions. So for the energy sector, there are opportunities to continue the work that's been happening around increasing renewable sources, such as wind and solar, and in turn further reducing the emissions from the grid. Then at the same time, it's important to address energy usage through increasing efficiency in buildings and moving toward zero carbon buildings. Then for transportation, as the emissions go down for the grid, there's an opportunity to shift towards a more electrified transportation system and towards other low carbon fuels. But it's also, again, important to not only looking at electrification, but also looking at increasing options and alternatives to driving alone. So this can be achieved through increasing access to public transit, investments in biking and walking infrastructure, or expanding what we're seeing in terms of the many emerging mobility options. Then while waste may be a smaller overall portion of the inventory from what Doug presented, it's still a very important piece of the pie. The emissions from organic waste can be addressed through programs that focus on food systems and reducing organics or food waste from the waste stream. Then there are also strategies to not just reduce carbon, but also to capture carbon through sequestration from forestry, grasslands, or agriculture land, for example. Turning to opportunities to adapt to climate change and build resilience. As Karen presented, we saw that heat and flooding are two of the major climate hazards for the region. So starting with heat, there are opportunities to address the urban heat island effect through the built environment. So that might be through increasing the number of cool roofs or green roofs, as well as expanding the tree canopy and shade, again, which was featured in looking at adaptive capacity. But it's also looking at how the region responds to increase in heat waves and other events. So where are the opportunities for relief from heat through cooling centers and other programs? I think one question that's top of mind for communities throughout the country as we prepare for this summer's heat is how may these strategies look different in light of COVID? And that those who are most vulnerable to heat-related illness have access to this heat relief. Then green infrastructure, it's a strategy that can both benefit cooling and help reduce stormwater runoff. And given that the region is likely to see both wetter and drier events, both flooding and drought, where are there opportunities to consider design and how to design communities, buildings, infrastructure systems that really look to adapt to these increasing extremes? And then with this forward-looking climate resilience lens, what could land use patterns look like and where and how best to focus development? Then I'll end it with some considerations around the overall approach. To reach the mid-century goals, there's an opportunity and really a need for transformative change at the systems level. And these are approaches that look across different systems and how projects can be multi-benefit. Then I've run through what different opportunities may look like, but how strategies are prioritized and implemented is integral to ensuring that equity is core to climate action. And as Karen walked through, when we look at climate resilience, it's not just where climate hazards will take place, but also which populations, locations, and systems are most vulnerable to those hazards. As a note, this is by no means an exhaustive list of strategies. It's more meant to provide some examples as the region moves into the next phase of the climate planning process. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tom.
Sabrina, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to be able to contextualize our work and from your more national practice and get a sense of what some of the key trends and opportunities might be. I'm going to take just a few minutes to quickly walk everybody through what's coming next. Alicia, if you would change to the next slide. We've had a lot of discussion about what we hope our planning outcomes from this process might be. I mean, of course, at the very highest level, we hope to have an action plan that helps us reduce emissions and adapt to change, but do so in ways that really help us achieve our broad visions towards sustainability and resilience. You heard a lot in Karen's presentation about the equity dimensions of climate change for our community. And so we have heard repeatedly from stakeholders throughout the region that using an equity lens to guide our decision making is absolutely central. We've highlighted some of the areas of clear risk and vulnerability and different communities and populations that might be at risk. And so our ability to target that is critical. Oftentimes, in the environmental community, we focus a lot on reducing things and minimizing damage. But the flip side of all of this is thinking about innovation and green economy, thinking about economic growth and vitality, and ways we can leverage our strengths to create jobs, to train our workforce, to create more wealth through green economic development. Some of that work, of course, intersects with flexible implementation models that support a circular economy. Oftentimes those ideas come up in realms of recycling and reuse, supply chain management. They're certainly visible as it applies to energy efficiency and renewables, or in land stewardship, thinking about soil restoration, stormwater management, and food security. As we work on all of this, we've recognized that funding is always tight to be able to accomplish what we want to do. So we need to think about new kinds of funding models that can support investment in the kinds of infrastructure and capacities that we need to address the problems in front of us. One of the ways that we can do that is we can look at current investment programs to take resiliency into account. I want to give a quick shout out to the City of Lawrence, who recently updated their policies that govern their capital improvement program, and they're deliberately taking into account issues of social equity and sustainability to guide capital improvement program investments. And I think that could be a really interesting model. Some years back in Kansas City, Missouri, sustainability was interjected as a key criterion for all decision making considered by the governing body, thinking about how we can leverage existing investments and inject a climate lens into those sorts of policies and plans, designs, investments, programs is something that's clearly in front of us. Thinking about, in turn, how all of those, how capital programs and investments link to local government mitigation and adaptation initiatives, thinking about how we can support local efforts, think about collaborative opportunities for implementation, how we can all help learn from each other from Liberty to Lee Summit is something that we know how to do, and we can expedite how quickly we can learn about what works and scale it up. We have a substantial need to create clear pathways for effective individual empowerment and action. So our plan really wants to go from an individual level to a community level to a regional level. One of the distinctive things, as Ryan commented early on, is that our plan is a regional one, but all regional plans are effective only insofar as there's local energy and commitment, leadership, and investment to take things forward at that level. And we can then create opportunities for alignment and coordination and collaboration to facilitate bigger impacts at larger scales. Finally, we want to think about performance tracking systems so we can really understand what the impact is of what we're doing, how we can maximize all the different kinds of co-benefits and keep moving over time. It's fairly clear to me that this whole process will be an iterative process and one that will take steps, we'll figure out what works, and we'll refine over time. So this chart represents where we are today. We're on the left side of this chart with community engagement. Though it's fair to say there's been a whole lot of work that's preceded the presentation today. For the next 6 weeks, we will be using MindMixer to discuss different kinds of topics and hear the community's thoughts about opportunities and strategies and priorities. And we will then take those findings and share them with a planning advisory committee and with expert stakeholder groups. But don't change yet. Go back to the previous slide, please. We'll work those through a committee process. We'll develop a plan, and then we'll share it back out with the community for further refinement and debate before we finalize everything by the end of the year. We hope to conclude our work by December and go from there. So we want to include your best thinking all along the way. So please engage with us to the extent that your time and interest permits. Okay, now on to the next slide. So Mike and Lindsay at the outset shared the link to MindMixer, climateactionkc.mindmixer.com. That's the platform that we're using. It's really user-friendly, and we invite you to share your thoughts about all different topics that are at play. We had a soft launch for this a couple weeks ago where we asked about, well, what are we learning from COVID that might be applied to climate? From starting really next week, we're going to begin having a week focused on transportation, then one on food and land, then built environment, energy and industry week, and then a wrap-up week on June 15th. And so in each week, there will be opportunities for very focused discussions on each of these topics. And that will allow us then at the end to be able to get a sense about what folks think is most important and how we can move it further. You'll note at the bottom there are 4 bullet points. We've organized the discussions by sector in transportation, food, land, and so forth. We hope, though, that we consider both the mitigation and adaptation aspects, and we've spoken a lot about, what we hope to achieve from this plan, and equity lens is critical, as we've discussed multiple times. How does innovation fit in? How does natural ecosystem health fit in? What about finance and so forth, and public health? These are all elements that cut across the different sector-based discussions and might create opportunities to think of in a more integrative sort of way. So with that, next slide, please. If there's one takeaway that I'd like for everybody to keep in mind after today, it's please visit us at the MindMixer website so that we can have a really rich conversation moving forward. We also can take comments from anybody at the website on the screen, climateactionkc@marc.org. You could certainly reach out to me individually at tjacobs@marc.org, or any of our staff or our colleagues at Climate Action KC or any of the organizations that are involved. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation. I apologize, we went a little longer than we anticipated, but we do have a few minutes for questions. So Karen, I believe you're monitoring the chat box. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Okay. Well, one of the questions that Rob Gibbons has asked is, how much influence can you have in the face of the lack of support from the U.S. administration right now? Anybody want to tackle that on the panel?
Can you say it one more time, please?
So how much influence can we really have here at the local level when we have a lack of support at the federal level?
I'm going to take that and then invite anybody else to join us. When Ryan started out in his presentation, he shared that there's a network of 10,000 municipalities spread across the globe, and that there's phenomenal level of effort at the local level. Where there's alignment with state and federal policy, folks seem to get further, but at the same time, we're well positioned to act here, and with the resources and skills and leadership and so forth that we have available to us. So I think what's in front of us is the opportunity to do what we can, and over time, as other opportunities emerge, we want to be ready to take advantage of them.
I can just, as Ryan here, I can just quickly add to that as well, to echo Tom's sentiments. I mean, when the current administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there was actually a huge backlash, and we saw the initiative Climate Mayors, which we work with closely on the Global Covenant of Mayors. There's 400 or I think maybe 500 now cities in the US that immediately, responded to that with the commitment to stay in the Paris Agreement, independent of the federal government. So, while we have to acknowledge that there may be some limitations in terms of resources and policy coming from the federal level, it's galvanized a lot of action at the local level, and including the work that we're doing here.
And to comment on what Ryan said earlier, cities have the biggest opportunity to reduce the number of emissions because we account for 70% of emissions out there. So cities really have the need, but also the opportunity, being the hubs of culture and innovation for hundreds of years coming from cities. While we don't have a one-size-fits-all model from the federal government, that actually gives us the opportunity to be more dynamic, to be leaner, to roll up our sleeves and be that community closest to the people that can get things done in a more expeditious fashion that actually fits Kansas City better than some plan that might come from Washington, D.C. So I think we are uniquely positioned to
That's great. Thank you. So maybe we'll take maybe one or two additional questions. So Madeline Malloy sent a really good question about kind of the process. And she asked, how do we plan to reach out to all sectors of the community, especially marginalized groups, via an online platform? Won't that cut people out who don't have digital access, who aren't familiar with environmental lingo process, or don't have the time to engage over a multi-week discussion process? I can take that answer. So yeah, one of the challenges that we're obviously facing is a transition to having to do most of our outreach and engagement digitally. However, we've made decisions along the way, like our use of MindMixer, which is a very mobile-friendly platform. We've decided to use that so we can make sure that people who have smartphones, which most people do have smartphones in our region, regardless of your income level, they have access to this platform. We don't expect everybody to want to engage over multi-week discussion processes, and so we allow some topics that are more generalized in MindMixer so that people can provide the input that they want to provide and move along at their own pace. Reaching out to marginalized groups will continue to be a challenge, whether we are doing this process digitally or we are able to meet face-to-face. We are working with a really great group of people from Climate Action KC who make up the Equity Committee. They have put together a really great list of stakeholder partnerships that we can leverage to help reach more vulnerable populations. And so how we reach them is we're still looking for opportunities that are maybe less digital to get feedback from them, and maybe it's a lot of phone calls. And so we're doing things like that right now, and we're certainly interested in any additional ideas that people have to make sure that everybody, all sectors, all geographies of the region have access to the tools to engage and actively can do so. Maybe just one last question before we wrap up. And we have a lot of great questions here, so I'll just say that we'll find an additional way to continue to answer them on a different platform. So one question is, why are we using the Paris climate goals and not the IPCC goals? Is that something that Tom, you can answer, or maybe Ryan?
I'll just make a note that when MARC and Climate Action KC made application to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, we said that we wanted to adhere to the Paris Accord targets and do the best that we could to meet those targets. Ryan, how do the Paris Accord targets relate to the IPCC targets?
Well, and maybe Sabrina can chip in on this because my knowledge might be a little bit spotty on the difference between the two. But there's the 2-degree target and the 1.5-degree target that generally nations and cities are adhering to. All I would say on it is that the 80% by 2050 kind of ballpark target is a highly ambitious one, and there's not too much more ambitious targets going on. That's pretty much where cities are setting their sights. And as Tom said earlier, I think this is an iterative process as we go through this planning process and realize more opportunities. There's opportunity to revisit that target and become more ambitious potentially. But I think in the current context, in the current climate, it's an ambitious target. Sabrina, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I think that I sort of would second what Brian has said.
Well, Karen, should we bring this to a close?
Sure.
Okay, I'm happy to stay on the line and take on additional questions if the technology allows, and if those who have joined us in the audience would like. Do you have a thought about that?
Well, we still have we have about 189 attendees still with us. I'm looking through some of the questions. We do have a lot of them that are related to the presentation. We will be posting the presentation both as a recorded webinar, but also the plain presentation itself. We'll be posting that on the MindMixer as a resource. We'll also be posting it at marc.org/climate-action and making it available at Climate Action KC's website as well. And I will send an email out to everybody. So there's multiple ways to access it. I'm trying to see if there's additional questions that maybe are kind of maybe important ones to address. One of them is specific to the Social Vulnerability Index that Jennifer Gunby posted, asking if the maps will be available online so we can drill down by city and or zip code. So that is our ultimate goal, is to make these not only useful for quickly assessing, you know, our regional vulnerability, but allowing local governments to get in and use them to help inform, you know, the planning and design of their projects as needed. So this is a larger initiative that MARC will be undertaking in the future, but hopefully we can get the indexes available in an interactive map online in the very near future. That's definitely a goal of ours. Looking through some of the other questions, there's quite a few of them, so be patient with me. There's a question from Jerry Schechter about, is there an opportunity to add another week to MindMixer to focus on equity issues? So we had considered doing that, but equity is integral to so many of the different sectors and how we respond to them that we want to talk about equity throughout the entire duration of the MindMixer engagement. So we'll have specific questions related to equity. One of the things that we want to include in the climate action plan is an equity statement, which really guides us forward in all of our work. It's something that we sort of live and work by. And so that would be a great opportunity for everyone to provide feedback on what does that equity statement look like. So stay tuned, join MindMixer, and you can find more information about those questions in there that we'll have throughout the 6 weeks.
Very good. Do you want to do one more and then we wind up? It looks like we've lost about 100 people or so.
Yeah. So one question from Manny Trio. Hi, Manny. What technology improvements or innovations are more likely to replace current emission sources in our region? Has anyone done any published return on investments on these technologies? Does anybody have their pulse on the finger of, or the pulse on technology improvements that could replace emission sources in our region? I know in transportation, we're looking a lot at on-road transportation and electrifying the fleet, and how, transitioning to automated vehicles can assist with some of that. I don't know about some of the other sectors. If Tom, you have any ideas? That's definitely something we could talk about on MindMixer too.
I think it's a good question, and it's a complex one depending on what sector you're talking about and what businesses or entities we're talking about. It was interesting just to note that in today's New York Times, there's a report that for the first time ever, that renewable energy use exceeded energy produced by coal, and it's because it's more affordable, right? And so I think that's a reflection of significant shifts in industry and in energy, in technology generally, towards cleaner and greener sources that create fewer emissions. And I think that's evident really regardless of which sector you're talking about. And so that set of trends and understanding processes and systems and impacts from a resilience and emissions perspective, everything seems to be going in the right direction. However, we probably have to get more specific to jump in a lot more. I think with that, I'm gonna take the liberty of closing out this webinar. We still have 134 people on the line, so we've lost about half of those who were here at the beginning. I want to thank everybody who's joined us for the last hour and a half. We really appreciate your time. We look forward to your working with us during this process. It's going to be a wonderful creative journey, and I can't wait to see where it ends up. And last, I'd like to thank all of our presenters. You all did a fantastic job. I especially like to thank Karen and Doug and Brian for all of your hard work in getting the inventory and the assessment done. It was incredibly hard, and so you did a great job, and the presentations were wonderful. With that, I thank everybody again, and have a wonderful afternoon.